It was the morning of December 29th, 2024, and Denver was still half asleep under a thin blanket of snow. Inside the DeWalt Infrastructure Group office, the heaters hummed and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air. I was the only one left on the floor finishing the final balance sheets of the year. My eyes ached from the glow of the monitor columns of numbers bleeding together until they stopped meaning anything. My phone buzzed beside the keyboard. At first, I didn't look. It was probably another end-of-year memo. When the vibration didn't stop, I flipped it over. It was a message from my father. This year, we won't be inviting you to the New Year's party. No greeting, no explanation. Just that. Before I could even process it, a blue thumbs up from Mom appeared underneath a red heart from Emily and a laughing emoji from Mark. A family agreement in pixels. I stared at the screen until my reflection blurred behind the text. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. My cursor blinked on the spreadsheet right next to a column labeled Family Expenses. Vail Event Center Rental, $2,800. Fireworks permit, $900. Dinner catering, $1,500. Every line in that column had my name next to it. My money, my signature. The same hands that paid for their laughter had just been uninvited. I leaned back in my chair, the old leather creaking. For a moment, I thought maybe it was a joke. Maybe my father had meant something else. But the chat kept lighting up, Emily sending a photo of champagne flutes, Mark dropping a gif of fireworks. They weren't joking. They were celebrating. My throat tightened. I could almost hear my father's voice saying the same thing he always did when I argued with him as a teenager. Don't make everything so personal, Sarah. But it was personal. It always had been. The heater kicked on again, the sound almost drowning out my thoughts. I opened the family spreadsheet, staring at the endless rows of automatic payments I'd set up for years. There were so many: the electric bill for their house, the car insurance for Emily's SUV, the monthly donation Mom liked to make to her church, but always forgot to fund herself. Every payment scheduled, every obligation attached to my name. My finger hovered over the touchpad. I heard my own voice in my head, calm, detached, the tone I used in meetings when I didn't want anyone to hear me shaking. When your family stops seeing you as one of them, they still want your money to prove they're whole. The sentence stayed with me, echoing as I logged into my bank portal. There was the account. There were the scheduled transfers. I took a breath and clicked cancel payment. A small pop-up appeared. Are you sure? I clicked yes. One after another, I erased myself from their traditions. The venue, the fireworks, the catering. Each confirmation message popped up, transaction voided successfully. The words looked clinical, final, like closing a file on someone's life. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the tall windows, slow and deliberate. They looked peaceful, nothing like the storm in my chest. I wanted to feel guilty. I tried to. But instead, what I felt was relief. Raw and startling, like oxygen after holding your breath too long. My computer screen dimmed as it timed out my reflection, faint in the black glass. Tired eyes' hair pulled too tight, the faint trace of someone who'd spent years being reliable. The good daughter, the one who never said no. I shut the laptop, the sound echoing through the empty office. The silence after it closed felt like something breaking and healing at the same time. My phone buzzed again. A new message from the group chat. Emily had sent a picture of her dress for the party, silver sequins shining under warm light. Dad replied. Perfect, Mom added. You'll steal the show. Mark sent a row of fireworks emojis. No one noticed my absence. No one mentioned me at all. I slipped the phone into my bag. The idea of replying felt absurd. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been ignored 100 times before. For years I'd convinced myself that showing up, paying, fixing, smoothing over, was the same as belonging. Maybe it was time to stop mistaking obligation for love. When I walked out of the office, the air hit cold and sharp. Downtown Denver shimmered with holiday lights, the streets muffled with snow. A family passed me on the sidewalk, a little girl dragging a sled behind her mother laughing. I felt the sting behind my eyes and kept walking. In the parking lot, my phone vibrated again. I didn't check it. I already knew what it would be. More plans, more chatter, more pretending. I started the car, the heater blowing cold air before it warmed. I glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard. 6:42 p.m., 2 days before the new year. The rearview mirror caught my face for a moment, framed by the falling snow outside the windshield. I looked older than 38 maybe, because years of holding things together had a way of aging you. If they don't need me, I whispered. They don't need my credit card either. The city lights blurred in the frost on the window as I drove away, the sound of the wipers, the only rhythm left in the car. Somewhere behind me, the office building went dark, and ahead, the snow kept falling. Clean, quiet, untouched. The snow had thickened by the time I turned into our street in Centennial. Every house was dressed for the holidays, string lights blinking in colors that felt too bright for how quiet the world had become. The radio played softly, that familiar tune of Auld Lang Syne humming like a lullaby for people who still believed in new beginnings. I parked in the driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a moment watching my breath cloud the windshield. The porch light flicked on. The door opened before I reached for the handle. Ethan stood there in his socks hair messy, grinning. "Mom, you're late." His voice carried the kind of excitement that didn't care about the time or the weather. I smiled, letting the cold air slap my cheeks awake. "The roads were bad," I said. "You shouldn't be standing barefoot like that." He shrugged, shuffling backward to make space as I stepped inside. The warmth of the house hit instantly, too warm, almost like the air itself was trying too hard to comfort me. "Did you eat?" I asked. "I waited," he said. "I thought we'd have lasagna." Again. I laughed softly. Again works. While I reheated the leftovers, he sat on the counter, kicking his feet against the cabinets. So he started careful. "Are Grandma and Grandpa coming for New Year's this time?" The question landed like a pebble in my chest, small but sharp. I set the plate in the microwave, pressed the button, and watched it spin. "Not this year, sweetheart," I said quietly. "It's just us." He nodded, eyes studying me. "Kids always know more than you think." "That's okay," he said finally. "We can do our own countdown." I forced a smile. "Yeah, we can." The microwave beeped. I plated the lasagna and we carried our dinner to the couch. We ate in silence, the TV flashing with commercials of families hugging and clinking champagne glasses. Every ad seemed designed to remind me of what wasn't there. "Mom, look," Ethan said, pointing at the screen. A family in matching pajamas was watching fireworks through a floor-to-ceiling window. "That's so cool," I nodded. "Yeah, it is." When we finished, he leaned against me, the warmth of his small body grounding me more than he could understand. "Can we stay up this year?" "For midnight," he asked through a yawn. "We'll see," I said. "You always fall asleep before the ball drops." "Not this time," he said, closing his eyes right after. By the time I tucked him in, the clock on his nightstand read 9:47. He was already half asleep, one arm thrown over the blanket. I turned off the lamp and whispered, "Good night, buddy." In the hallway, I hesitated before shutting his door. The house was still except for the hum of the heater. Downstairs, the glow from the Christmas lights outside bled through the curtains, scattering across the floor. I sat on the couch, pulled my phone from my bag, and opened the family group chat again. It was still active, messages piling in as if nothing had happened. Emily had sent a photo of herself in a sequined silver dress holding a glass of champagne. Her caption read, "Ready for the best night ever." Dad replied with, "That's my girl," Mom added. "You look stunning." Mark dropped a line of fireworks emojis. I scrolled through, waiting for someone to mention me. They didn't. For years, I'd been the one organizing these nights, making sure the bills were paid, the lights were up, the food arrived on time. I had been the invisible thread that held it together, and when I stopped pulling, the whole thing unraveled. I stared at Emily's perfect smile on the screen, the one that had never known a moment of consequence. I should have felt angry. Instead, I felt hollow. I locked the phone and set it on the coffee table face down. The silence that followed was thick. I caught my reflection in the dark TV screen, tired, older than 38, with eyes that looked like they'd seen too many family moments performed for photos. On the fridge, Ethan's New Year's goals list fluttered slightly under the draft from the vent. His handwriting was big and uneven. Be kinder. Be stronger. The simplicity of it made me smile, even as something in my chest ached. I stood there for a moment, tracing the words with my eyes, and whispered to myself, "Be free." Outside, a neighbor's fireworks cracked early across the night sky, scattering red and white light through the window. I walked closer and watched their reflection shimmer across the glass, painting my face in fleeting colors. For a second, the world felt suspended, just me, the snow, and the faint echo of laughter from somewhere far down the block. The smell of lasagna still lingered in the air, mixed with the faint scent of the pine candle Ethan insisted we light after dinner. I blew it out, the smoke curling upward like a sigh. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked, probably Ethan turning in his sleep. The house settled again. I went to the kitchen sink and rinsed the plates, the water running hot enough to sting my fingers. My mind kept drifting back to the message. "We won't be inviting you." The words replayed in a loop, cold and precise. It wasn't the first time I'd been left out of something, but this time it felt permanent, as if they were closing a door I hadn't realized was still open. I wiped my hands and leaned against the counter. I could call them, I thought. I could demand an explanation, force a confrontation, but I already knew how it would go. Dad denying any cruelty, Mom trying to soften it. Emily pretending it wasn't her fault. It would end with me apologizing just to keep the peace. That had always been my role. The peacekeeper, the fixer, the wallet. No more, I thought. Not this time. The fridge hummed. Outside, a car rolled slowly past its tires, whispering through the snow. I turned off the kitchen light and stood by the window again. The reflection that looked back at me wasn't the one I remembered. There was something steadier there now, something almost calm. I used to think I was part of the picture, I murmured to the empty room. Turns out I was just the one taking it. The fireworks flared again in the distance, lighting up the clouds for a heartbeat, before the dark swallowed everything back. I watched until the last spark faded, then drew the curtains closed, and headed upstairs, leaving the house quiet, except for the soft, steady breathing of my son. The next morning, the cold felt sharper, like the air itself was holding its breath. I left early for work, the roads dusted white with powder that hadn't been plowed yet. Denver in late December has this way of looking beautiful and exhausted at the same time, like it's trying to recover from too many holidays. At the intersection near Colfax Avenue, the light turned red, and that's when I saw them. 5 or 6 people huddled outside a squat brick building with a faded blue sign. Second Chance Shelter. Steam rose from paper cups in their hands. Someone had scrawled a message on a cardboard sheet propped against the door. "Help us make it through winter." I sat there longer than the light allowed, watching a man bend to wrap his coat around a dog that was trembling beside him. He didn't even have gloves. The horn of a car behind me broke the stillness. I pressed the gas and drove on. But the image stuck. It's strange. The people with the least often know how to share the most. By the time I parked at the DeWalt building, the thought had already begun to turn over in my mind, pressing against something buried, something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. I'd spent years paying for people who never thanked me, and here were strangers who'd thank anyone for a warm cup of coffee. The office was quiet, most people taking the last days of the year off. My footsteps echoed down the hallway as I hung my coat and tried to shake the cold from my hands. When I reached my desk, I saw a text from my assistant asking if I wanted to confirm the family event payments. I ignored it. I was halfway to the break room when Nathan Cooper, our CEO, stepped out of his office. He had that half-smile he used when he was about to ask a question he already knew the answer to. "Morning, Sarah. Did you finalize your family's event payments?" I met his eyes. I canceled them. He blinked once, clearly not expecting that. Canceled every one of them. He hesitated, adjusting his tie. "That'll cause trouble, won't it?" "Not for me," I said, and kept walking. Back in my office, I sat down, the leather chair creaking under me. I stared at my reflection in the window. My own face looked different, steadier somehow, like the fog had cleared. My father's text still sat unread at the top of my phone. I thought about deleting it, but decided to let it sit there like a scar. Something that didn't hurt anymore, but still reminded you where the pain had been. By the end of the day, the city was sliding into dusk, the sky a bruised purple. I couldn't shake the image of that shelter. Instead of driving home, I turned back toward Colfax. The same building stood beneath a single flickering streetlight. The parking lot was full, the windows glowing faint yellow. I parked, grabbed my purse, and walked toward the door. Inside, the air smelled like soup and coffee, and something else, something human, maybe survival. Folding tables lined the room, covered with trays of donated bread and a slow cooker of chili. A few people looked up as I entered, unsure of me. A woman in her mid-50s approached, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes bright and clear. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for Laura Jenkins," I said. "That's me." I extended my hand. "I'm Sarah Whitmore." She shook it firmly. "We don't usually get visitors this late in the year," she said, studying me with a curiosity that wasn't unkind. "You here to volunteer?" "Not tonight." I opened my purse and pulled out an envelope slightly crumpled from the drive. "This is for the shelter." Her eyes flicked to the envelope, then back to me. "You don't have to hand-deliver donations. We've got an online portal for that." "I know," I said. "I needed to do this in person." She took the envelope and unfolded the check inside. Her brow lifted as she read the number. 5,200. I nodded. "They wanted fireworks," I said quietly. "I wanted light in the right place." For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she looked straight at me, the corners of her mouth softening into something halfway between a smile and a sigh. "Most people give out of pity," she said. "You give out of anger. Maybe anger's just grief with better posture." Laura chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Whatever it is you just paid for 3 nights of heat for 30 people, that hit harder than I expected. 30 people. 3 nights. My family had planned to burn that much in one evening on champagne and sparklers." I followed her deeper into the shelter. A small boy was coloring on the floor beside a cot while his mother stirred soup. A man was fixing a broken space heater with duct tape and a screwdriver. They didn't look defeated. They looked alive, Laura said. "You'd be surprised how many people come here thinking they're saving someone. Turns out they're the ones who needed saving." I watched the boy laugh at something his mom said. Maybe I whispered. She looked at me for a long time. "You can come back tomorrow, you know. Help serve dinner. We can always use extra hands." I thought about it, about spending the last day of the year here, instead of at home pretending not to care about the family party I'd been cut out of. "Maybe I will," I said. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me full in the face. The night air smelled faintly of smoke and coffee. I stood under the flickering streetlight and watched my breath disappear into the dark. For once, my anger had built something instead of breaking me. I got in the car and sat there for a while, engine off, listening to the distant hum of traffic. The shelter's light glowed through the windshield like a small heartbeat in the dark. I thought of Ethan at home, probably asleep with his lamp still on his New Year's goals list, still taped to the fridge. I started the car and drove home slowly, letting the heater thaw the chill from my fingers. The roads were empty, the snow glittering beneath the streetlights. Somewhere far off, a single firework went off, early red against the black sky. I didn't flinch this time. The dashboard clock flipped to 10:15. Tomorrow would be December 31st, the day they celebrated without me. For the first time, I didn't dread it. By morning, the storm had already started. My phone buzzed across the kitchen counter. As I poured coffee, the group chat lighting up like a slot machine gone mad. Emily. "Who canceled all the payments?" "Mom." "David, it was her, wasn't it, Dad?" "That girl's been a problem since she learned how to talk." I stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the reply bar before locking the phone instead. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, but it suddenly tasted bitter. Ethan's backpack lay by the door, his science project poking out of the top. I grabbed my coat, dropped him at his friend's house for the day, and drove into the city before the news found its way anywhere else. At every red light, my phone vibrated. The group chat kept breathing without me. Emily again. "Now the venue says we lost the deposit." Mom's response came seconds later. "Sarah always ruins things." Dad's bubble popped up, then vanished. I could almost hear his voice sharp, measured the same tone he used in court before retirement. Controlled fury, disguised as reason. By the time I reached the office, I already knew this wouldn't stay private. Emily had friends who made careers out of broadcasting drama. It was only a matter of time before one of them caught the scent. Around 10, my coworker Michelle stopped by my desk phone in hand. "You seeing this?" she asked. I shook my head even though I didn't want to. She turned the screen toward me. There it was, a post from one of Emily's influencer friends' family drama before the biggest party of the year #canceled plans, underneath hundreds of likes and comments. "Whitmore family broke," one person wrote. Another chimed in, "Scandal much." They looked fake anyway. I felt heat crawl up my neck. It didn't matter that the comments weren't true. People believed what entertained them. Bad news travels faster than fireworks. The truth limps behind. At 11, my phone rang. Tom Reeves, my old law school friend turned financial attorney. His voice came through steady calm like always. "I heard your dad's making calls. He can't sue you. It's your card, your funds. But he'll try anyway. You ready for that?" "I've been ready my whole life," I said. He laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because he understood. "You sure you don't want me to send a cease and desist for that influencer post?" "No," I said. "Let them talk." Words don't cost as much as silence does. By lunch, the phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Texts from coworkers, distant relatives, numbers I didn't recognize. Everyone wanted to know if it was true, if the Whitmores had fallen apart over a canceled party. I ignored them all. The office hummed around me, but my mind was elsewhere. When my desk phone rang, I almost didn't pick up. But the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "You humiliated this family," my father said. No hello, no pause. I took a deep breath. I stopped paying for the illusion of one. "Don't get clever with me, Sarah," he snapped. "Do you have any idea what this looks like?" "Yes," I said. "For once, I do." He exhaled sharply. "You've always been dramatic. You don't bite the hand that raised you. Maybe the hand shouldn't have treated me like an investment." The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. Then the line clicked dead. I sat there for a long moment, phone still pressed to my ear. A faint ringing in my head wouldn't stop. The urge to cry came and went, replaced by something calmer. Not peace exactly, clarity. I packed up early, told Michelle I wasn't feeling well, and drove out of downtown. The traffic lights blinked through the snow, painting the windshield in red and green. Without planning to, I found myself driving toward the city overlook, a place I hadn't been in years. The road curved upward, the skyline opening like a painting behind me. When I parked, Denver stretched out below, a scatter of lights under a pale sky. The air was freezing, the kind of cold that burned in the lungs. But I rolled down the window anyway. From up there, everything looked small. The buildings, the cars, even the noise. The city pulsed with life that had nothing to do with me or my family, or their perfect parties. It was both comforting and sad to realize the world kept spinning even when yours stalled. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Mom. Just 3 words. "Please stop this." No explanation. No apology. I didn't answer. There was nothing to stop. I watched as the clouds above the city caught the faint color of sunset, streaks of orange and violet bleeding together. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale against the leather. Sometimes silence says what shouting never could. I stayed until the first lights of evening flickered across downtown. Then I started the car. The heater sighing to life, and drove back down the hill, away from the skyline, away from everything that had once defined me. By 8 that night, the Whitmore house in Greenwood Village looked like a stage set after the curtain had dropped. Expensive, silent, and wrecked by everything left unsaid. My father stood in the kitchen, his reflection warped in the marble countertop, a half-empty whiskey glass, sweating beside him. "She ruined everything," he shouted, slamming the glass so hard that the sound cracked through the house. My mother flinched. Her hands trembled as she tried to steady the bottle before it tipped. "David, please." But Emily was already crying. Her phone clutched tight like a lifeline. "I lost 2 sponsorships today," she wailed. "People are laughing at me. They think I can't even pay for my own party." Mark sat on one of the bar stools, eyes fixed on the floor. "Maybe one of your friends leaked the screenshots, Em. Stuff like this doesn't go viral without help." Emily turned on him. "Are you kidding me? My friends wouldn't do that." My father's face flushed red. "Stop fighting, both of you." He pointed at the phone in Emily's hand. "She wants to destroy us." "Well, fine. I'll destroy her first." He grabbed his own phone from the counter and scrolled through his contacts. My mother reached for his wrist. "David, please stop before it gets worse." He tore his arm away. "Worse. You raised her to defy me. Don't tell me how to handle this." Margaret's voice was small, trembling. "She's still your daughter." "Not anymore," he growled, pacing across the tile. "She wants a war, she'll get one." The chandelier above them trembled slightly as he slammed his fist against the counter again. The sound echoed through the house, rattling the delicate wine glasses in the cabinet. Meanwhile, miles away, our house was filled with the smell of tomato sauce and burnt crust. Ethan and I were into the kitchen, rolling out dough that didn't quite fit the pan. "Too much flour?" he asked, looking at the mess on the counter. "Maybe just enough," I said. "Cooking's like math you can eat." He grinned, spreading sauce unevenly across the dough. "Grandma would freak out if she saw this. I'm sure she would." I said, reaching for the cheese. We layered mozzarella and pepperoni like it was an art project. He licked a bit of sauce off his thumb and looked up at me. "Mom, do they hate you now?" The question hit quietly, but it still hurt. I met his eyes, honest but gentle. Maybe I said, But they're not angry because they lost me. They're angry because they lost control. He nodded like he understood more than a 12-year-old should. That sounds like something my teacher would write on the board. I laughed softly. Maybe she should. We slid the pizza into the oven, and the warmth filled the kitchen. Ethan set the table with paper plates, too careful for his age, trying to make it look special. "When the ball drops, can we bang pots outside like last year?" he asked. "Of course," I said. "We can make as much noise as we want." The oven timer dinged, and I pulled the pizza out, the crust browned at the edges, cheese bubbling over. Ethan took the first bite before it cooled. Melted cheese slid down his slice and landed on the plate with a splat. He laughed. "You make better pizza than Grandma." I smiled. "Don't tell her that. She'll revoke our invite to next year's imaginary party." He giggled, almost choking on laughter. "Then it's just us again. Just us, I said. Outside, the snow drifted against the window in soft waves, muting the world beyond. Inside, our small house glowed gold under the kitchen light. The sound of Ethan's laughter bounced off the walls, filling spaces that had been too quiet for too long. Across town, I could almost picture my father's face twisted in anger. Emily sobbing into her hands. My mother whispering prayers she didn't believe would work. I imagined the cold creeping through their perfect home, the silence between them louder than any argument. The closer midnight came, the warmer our little house felt, and the colder theirs must have been. Ethan finished his slice and leaned back in his chair, sleepy and full. "Can we stay up till midnight this time?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "I'll try." I said, "No, I mean you, Mom." I laughed. "We'll see." He smiled, satisfied with that answer, and wandered off to his room. I stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up the mess, the scent of garlic and flour clinging to my hands. I stood by the window and looked out at the quiet street. Every house glowed with the same soft light curtains drawn families gathered inside. Theirs were probably loud, messy, complicated. Mine was quiet, but it was honest. On the counter, my phone buzzed once, lighting up with a new message from an unknown number. I didn't need to read it to know who it was. I turned the screen face down. In the distance, a faint cheer rose as the neighborhood kids tested fireworks early. The sound was light, fleeting, and gone almost as soon as it arrived. I leaned against the counter, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the soft rhythm of Ethan's footsteps upstairs. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something, or someone, to fix it. The house was small. The night was cold, but peace, it turned out, didn't need to be loud. It was 1 minute before midnight when the world outside my window started to shake with anticipation. The TV in the corner was counting down from 10, muffled by the sound leaking from a neighbor's open window. Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch beside me, his head resting on my arm, the faint smell of tomato sauce still clinging to his hair. The house was dim except for the glow from the streetlights and the flicker of the television. I glanced at my phone lying face up on the coffee table. It vibrated again, lighting up like a restless heartbeat. The screen flashed name after name. Dad. Mom, Emily. Over and over. 27 missed calls. The notifications stacked one on top of another. Emily's text popped first. "Fix this, Sarah, then Mom." People are asking about the canceled venue. And finally, Dad's voice written in the words he'd never had to say out loud. "You're not part of this family anymore." I picked up the phone, stared at it for a long moment, then set it back down. Face down this time, the vibration continued muted and meaningless. I reached for the remote and turned off the TV just before the crowd outside could reach zero. The silence in the house was sudden and clean. Outside, the first firework burst above the neighborhood. Gold streaks cutting across the black sky, followed by another and another. The sound was distant, soft like thunder, that had forgotten to be angry. Ethan stirred beside me but didn't wake. His hand twitched against the blanket. I brushed a strand of hair from his forehead and whispered, "Happy New Year, kiddo." Karma doesn't need a schedule. It just waits for the clock to strike truth. I sat there long after the fireworks faded, the last sparks drifting like dying stars across the sky. The phone stopped buzzing. The heater clicked off. The house exhaled. Morning came, gray and quiet. I woke to the faint chirp of the coffee maker and the creak of the floor under my feet. Ethan was still asleep, curled in a cocoon of blankets, his face peaceful. I checked my phone out of habit. It was worse than I expected. Hundreds of notifications, new texts, and one headline flashing across every feed: Woman cancels family party, donates funds to homeless shelter. Underneath the Denver Gazette logo glowed like a seal of confirmation. There was a photo of the shelter's entrance snow piled high around the door, and a single line quoting the article, "They wanted fireworks. She wanted light in the right place." I sat down, coffee trembling slightly in my hand as the comments began to scroll in faster than I could read. "She's a legend. Best use of money all year. This woman deserves a medal." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Somewhere between the two, I just exhaled and leaned back in the chair. Across town, though I couldn't see it, I imagined what was happening at the house in Greenwood Village. The kitchen probably looked the same as always, perfectly polished, sterile, the kind of place that photographed well for Christmas cards. But the people inside it, they'd be unraveling. In my mind, I could see my father sitting at the marble counter again. Same as last night, the whiskey glass now empty, the newspaper folded neatly beside him. The mail sat in a pile, envelopes from clients' bills, and one official-looking letter, stamped with the seal of the Internal Revenue Service. He'd open it, read the first line, and freeze. Notice of audit. My mother would hover behind him, still wearing her robe, her hair pinned in a neat twist, as if presentation might still save her. "David," she'd whisper. "What is it?" He'd keep reading, eyes scanning faster, jaw tightening. "It's nothing," he'd snap. "Just a mistake." But she'd see the tremor in his hand when he reached for his glass, the way his lips pressed together too tightly. "David, what did you do?" she'd ask again, softer this time. "Nothing," he'd repeat, his voice breaking on the word. I could almost hear her gasp when she realized the truth she didn't want to name, that maybe, just maybe, everything he'd built was starting to crack, and I had nothing to do with it. I didn't plan their downfall. I just stopped cushioning their fall. The morning light filtered through the blinds, slicing the kitchen into stripes of gold and gray. Ethan wandered in, rubbing his eyes, his hair sticking up on one side. "Did I miss it?" he mumbled. "The fireworks." I smiled. "Just a few." He squinted at me. "Did they look cool?" "They did," I said, "but you didn't miss much." He climbed into the chair across from me, stealing the last piece of toast from my plate. "You look happy," he said. Said through a mouthful. "Do I? Yeah. Like when you finish one of those big reports at work and finally close your laptop." I laughed. "That's a pretty specific kind of happy." He shrugged. "It's a good one." We spent the morning quietly. I cleaned the kitchen while Ethan built a tower from his Lego set on the living room floor. Outside, kids in the neighborhood dragged sleds down the street, their laughter rising and falling like wind chimes. Around noon, a notification blinked across my phone. An email from Laura Jenkins at the shelter. "Thank you again. Your donation covered emergency heating for the entire week." The kids asked who to thank, and I told them your name. I smiled at the screen, then looked at Ethan. "Want to go for a drive later?" Where he asked, eyes still on his Legos, somewhere that matters. I said. He didn't ask what I meant. He just nodded. I stood by the window for a moment, watching sunlight glitter over the snow. The air looked clean, like everything had reset overnight. In Greenwood Village, I knew my father would be pacing, phone pressed to his ear, trying to control a situation that had already slipped beyond his reach. Mom would be sitting quietly, avoiding his eyes. Emily would be crying again, scrolling through comments she couldn't delete. But here in this small house, peace felt loud enough to fill every corner. The world outside might still be spinning with noise and gossip, but inside the only sound was the steady tick of the kitchen clock, marking the first morning of a new year. I didn't owe to anyone but myself. The phone rang just as the coffee finished brewing. The morning sun was barely a suggestion through the kitchen blinds, a thin, pale light cutting across the counter. I reached for my mug and my phone at the same time, expecting another reporter or a curious stranger. Instead, the caller ID read, "Tom Reeves. Your father just filed a lawsuit," he said. Not bothering with hello. I took a sip of coffee before answering. Of course he did. He's claiming you damaged the family's reputation and seized funds meant for joint property. Tom continued. It's nonsense, but he's angry, and he wants to make a spectacle of it. I leaned against the counter. He's consistent. Always fights harder for his pride than his people. I figured you'd say that, he replied, rustling papers on his end. Come by my office this morning. We'll go through the paperwork together. Just brace yourself. Okay. This might get loud. Let it... I said, setting the mug down. Maybe the truth needs better lighting. By 9, I was sitting in his office downtown, surrounded by glass walls and the muted hum of traffic below. Tom spread the documents across the table, neat as always, his reading glasses low on his nose. Look at this, he said, tapping the top page. Everything they list as family expenses. It's all in your name. Venue, rental, catering, fireworks permits. All paid with your account. He doesn't have a case. I scanned the pages, my father's signature nowhere to be found. Then why file it? Because it's not about winning. Tom said, it's about control. He wants you rattled. I smiled faintly. Then he's going to be disappointed. Tom studied me for a moment. You know, most people in your position would be furious right now. I admitted. Years ago. He leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. That might be why he'll lose. The rest of the meeting blurred. Signatures, dates, copies, legal language that looked sterile compared to the chaos it described. When I left the January airbit, threw my coat, clean and cutting. The city was awake now, full of horns and motion, but I walked slower than everyone else, as if moving faster might shake loose the calm I'd found. By afternoon, the first email came through. Subject line, interview request. Denver Gazette. I almost deleted it until I saw the name. Lisa Tran. The same journalist who'd written the original article about the donation. Her message was short, polite, professional. She wanted a follow-up. Your voice, your side. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. We met that evening at a quiet coffee shop near Cherry Creek, the kind of place where people whispered, and the baristas never made small talk. Lisa arrived on time, scarf wrapped tight, her notepad already in hand. She ordered tea, I stuck with coffee. For a few minutes, we talked about the weather, the snowstorm coming later in the week. Then she got to it. Did you do it for revenge? She asked. Her tone was soft, but the question landed heavy. I stirred my cup slowly. No, I did it to stop pretending that money makes us a family. She looked up from her notes. That's going to sting them more than the lawsuit. Maybe, I said, but I'm done trying to soften the truth. My father raised me to believe appearances mattered most. I just stopped agreeing with him. Lisa smiled, the kind that meant she understood something deeper than she'd ask on record. You know, she said, people online are calling you a hero. I'm not one, I said quickly. I just got tired of financing my own erasure. We talked another half hour about families, image boundaries. She promised to send me a draft before it went to print. I thanked her and stepped out into the cold. The wind had picked up snow, swirling across the streetlights like static. Driving home, I thought about what she'd said. A hero. The word didn't fit. Heroes fix things. I'd simply stopped pretending they weren't broken. When I got home, Ethan was sitting cross-legged on the couch, a blanket draped over his shoulders, his tablet glowing in his hands. Mom. He said you're on the news again. I froze. What kind of news? The good kind. He turned the screen to show me. The headline read, Kindness with Boundaries. Beneath it, a photo of the shelter, the same one from before, and a smaller picture of me at the coffee shop. The quote in bold, I did it to stop pretending that money makes us a family. I sank down beside him. That was fast, I said quietly. Ethan scrolled through the comments, reading a few aloud. She's brave. Finally, someone saying no to toxic family stuff. This woman's my spirit animal. He looked up at me, eyes bright. People think you're brave. I reached out, brushing the hair from his forehead. Bravery's just what truth looks like when it's tired of waiting. He smiled, satisfied, and turned back to his tablet. The glow of the screen flickered across his face, innocent and curious. After he went to bed, I sat in the living room reading the article again in the quiet. The words didn't feel like mine anymore. They belonged to the thousands of strangers who'd decided what they meant. The story had become something larger. Something I couldn't control, just like my father's anger. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper that keeps echoing. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but inside, the house stayed still. For once, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. The courthouse smelled like paper polish and old anger. It was January 10th, the kind of cold morning that left breath hanging in the air even indoors. I sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded. Eyes on the judge's bench, pretending not to notice the cameras lining the back wall. Across the aisle, my father sat stiff in his tailored gray suit, his posture perfect. As if good posture could rewrite the truth. My mother sat beside him, eyes down. Her hands clasped tight in her lap. She hadn't looked at me once since I'd walked in. Tom leaned toward me and whispered, "Remember, don't react. He wants a scene." "I know," I whispered back. The judge. A woman in her 50s, with calm eyes and a face that had seen too much pride and too little humility, adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Whitmore, you allege your daughter damaged your reputation and seized funds that were not hers. Do you have evidence?" My father's lawyer, a younger man with too much confidence and too little awareness, rose and handed over a folder. "Your Honor, these are the receipts my client provided. They show his daughter canceled payments for a family event leading to financial loss and reputational harm." Tom stood. "Your Honor, every transaction listed here was made using Ms. Whitmore's personal account. The contracts were signed solely under her name. Legal ownership, her signature, her funds. No joint assets involved." The judge flipped through the folder briefly, then looked up. "This seems straightforward." That should have been the end of it, but my father couldn't stand silence. Not when he was losing. He slammed his hand on the table. "She humiliated us," he shouted. The room went still. The judge's gavel hit wood sharp and quick. "Order, Mr. Whitmore. This is not a therapy session." A few chuckles rippled through the gallery before dying out. I kept my eyes forward, not trusting myself to look at him. Tom spoke again, steady as a heartbeat. "Your Honor, this case has no standing. It's retaliation, nothing more." The judge nodded once firm. Motion to dismiss granted. The sound of the gavel fell again, final this time. My father's chair scraped back. He stood face red and stormed out before the judge could even finish speaking. Cameras flashed as soon as he hit the hallway. I stayed seated for a moment, waiting for the noise to fade. Tom placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did good," he said quietly. Outside, the air was colder than before. The crowd had gathered at the courthouse steps, reporters, photographers, and people who just wanted to see a spectacle. As I stepped into the light, I caught a glimpse of my father shoving past a microphone shoved in his face. A reporter's voice cut through the noise. "Mr. Whitmore, any comment about the case?" He turned sharply. "Get that out of my face." His hand pushed the mic away a little too hard. The reporter stumbled, caught herself, and someone's camera clicked at the exact wrong moment, or the exact right one. Tom sighed beside me. "Well, that'll look great online." I didn't answer. I just watched him march toward his car coat, flaring behind him like a cape he no longer deserved to wear. My mother trailed behind, slower, smaller somehow. For a brief second she looked back, just enough for our eyes to meet. Then she lowered her gaze and kept walking. By the time I reached my car, my phone was already vibrating. I ignored it until I got home. Ethan was at school. The house quiet, except for the hum of the heater. I set my purse down and opened the laptop. The headline was already everywhere. "Local lawyer loses temper in courthouse meltdown." The article came with a still photo of him mid-shout. The microphone tilted awkwardly, his face caught in that moment before rage and regret blur together. The comment section was merciless. That apple didn't fall far from the family's hypocrisy tree. Guess now we know where his daughter got her backbone. Classic Whitmore temper. I scrolled until my hands started to shake. It wasn't joy, not really. Just the strange quiet that comes when you realize the truth is finally visible without you having to explain it. My laptop dinged again. A new message. From Mom. "I'm sorry, Sarah." I stared at it, fingers frozen over the keyboard. Then I typed 2 words back. "I know." The screen dimmed after a while, my reflection faint in the black glass. My face looked tired, older than I remembered. But something about the lines around my mouth looked softer too, like the tension that had lived there for years had finally loosened. Sometimes the verdict doesn't come from the judge. It comes from the crowd watching. Outside, the wind pushed snow across the street, erasing old footprints, making everything look untouched again. I closed the laptop and turned off the light, letting the house sink into stillness. For the first time, silence didn't sound like absence. It sounded like peace earned the hard way. A week passed before the fallout settled into something quieter, heavier. The noise online faded. but what was left behind was worse. A kind of silence that buzzed with shame. Emily's contracts dropped one by one. 3 brands in a single night. I saw the headlines before she probably did. Whitmore influencer loses partnerships. Amid family scandal, her followers turned faster than I thought they would. The same people who had once written family goals under her posts now filled her comments with fire. I didn't feel satisfaction, just a kind of numb understanding. The universe was handling what I couldn't. Mark packed his bags 2 days later. I heard about it through someone at DeWalt who still kept tabs on my sister's social media. His final words were caught on a live stream she hadn't realized was still running. "I can't live like this circus anymore," he said, grabbing his keys. "You care more about followers than people." He walked out while she was still filming an apology video. My father's law firm received a notice of a deeper IRS investigation. The same journalist who had covered my case posted an update on the Gazette's site local attorney, under audit for potential misreporting of funds. No names were mentioned, but they didn't need to be. Everyone knew. Mom stopped going to her church meetings. Neighbors called friends texted, and she avoided them all. I imagined her standing in the kitchen phone in hand, pretending not to see it light up, pretending that silence could erase what pride had exposed. Then one morning I found the letter. It was in my mailbox, no return address, just my name written in that familiar cursive that still felt like childhood. I sat in the driver's seat before opening it, the winter air turning my breath into fog. The paper shook slightly as I unfolded it. I stayed silent because I feared losing him. But I lost you instead. If there's any grace left, I hope you can forgive me. Mom, the handwriting blurred as my eyes filled. I pressed the paper against the steering wheel and let the tears come hot and unguarded. Forgiveness isn't for them. It's for the part of you that's still bleeding. When the tears stopped, I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. I didn't know what I felt. Sadness, anger, relief, maybe all 3. I started the car, but didn't drive home. Instead, I turned toward Colfax, toward the shelter. Snow was falling again, light and steady. The windows of Second Chance Shelter glowed against the gray sky. Inside it was warm, the air filled with the smell of coffee and something baking. Laura Jenkins was at her desk reading paperwork under a lamp. When she looked up and saw me, she smiled softly. "I was wondering when you'd stop by," she said. "The world's been loud about you lately. Tell me about it." I said, sitting across from her, "I came here because I didn't know where else to go." She poured tea into 2 mismatched mugs and pushed one toward me. That's usually the right reason. We sat for a moment, the only sound the rattle of wind against the windows. "You can stop feeling guilty now," Laura said gently. "The universe has a way of balancing accounts." I stared into the tea, watching steam rise. "I used to think money fixed things," I murmured. "Turns out it only exposes who's willing to repair." Laura leaned back, her eyes soft. "That's the real inheritance, isn't it? Knowing when to walk away." Outside, a man was kneeling to zip a little boy's coat, his hands red from the cold. The boy laughed when the zipper caught his chin, and the man apologized, kissing the top of his head. I couldn't look away. "That man," I said quietly, nodding toward the window. "He looks like he's got nothing, but I think he has everything that matters." Laura followed my gaze. "He used to be an accountant," she said. "Lost his job, his home, everything. Came here last year. Now he helps us with paperwork and teaches the kids math after dinner." I smiled, the tears returning softer this time. "You ever wonder how many people we misjudge just because they stopped pretending?" "All the time," Laura said. "You did the same thing, didn't you? You stopped pretending." I nodded, "and I think that's why they hate me so much. They don't hate you." She said, "They hate what you showed them. You didn't destroy their family. You revealed it." Her words settled in the space between us. The truth of them felt both freeing and painful. When I left the shelter, the snow had picked up. It dusted my hair, my coat, my gloves. The city was quiet, blanketed in white, the kind of quiet that feels like a reset. Maybe the only family I needed was the kind that understood peace. I got into my car and sat there with the engine running, the heater humming low. The letter from my mother lay on the passenger seat beside me. I didn't know if I'd ever write her back, but for the first time I didn't feel the need to. The snow fell harder, and for a moment the world outside disappeared in white. It didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like release. Mid-January came with a kind of calm that felt suspicious, like the quiet right before a thunderclap. The news had finally slowed. The gossip sites moved on to someone else's scandal, but I could still feel the echo of it every time I walked into DeWalt. Whispers, half smiles, the kind of politeness that's just curiosity dressed in manners. That morning, I got the email from HR. "Please stop by our office at your earliest convenience." The sentence was short, polite, and loaded. I walked down the long corridor lined with glass walls and pale wood doors. The HR director, Melissa, was already standing when I arrived, folder in hand. Her expression was the kind reserved for people who didn't want to give bad news, but liked being the one trusted to deliver it. "Sarah," she said, gesturing toward the chair, "we wanted to talk about the recent media attention surrounding your family situation." I nodded, folding my hands. "I figured this was coming." She sighed, glancing down at her notes. "Given the visibility of the situation and the nature of your position, we think it's best to place you on temporary leave, just until things cool off." I stared at the polished edge of the desk, my reflection warped in the surface. "Is that a suspension?" "No, not disciplinary," she said quickly. "It's a pause. A pause." That word again. Everyone loved pauses, because they sounded gentler than endings. I stood, smoothing my jacket. "All right," I said. "I'll take the pause." Melissa looked relieved, as if she'd been bracing for tears or anger. "You're handling this very professionally, Sarah." "I've had practice," I said, and walked out. For the next week, my days blurred together. I cleaned the house, answered a few polite emails, ignored the rest. Ethan noticed before anyone else. "Why aren't you going to work?" he asked one morning over breakfast. "I'm taking some time off," I said. "Because of Grandpa." "Because sometimes adults need a break, too." He nodded, satisfied with the half-truth, and went back to his cereal. By the time the 7th day rolled around, I'd made peace with the idea that maybe DeWalt wouldn't call back. Maybe this was my sign to move on, start over somewhere else. But just as I was finishing dishes, my phone rang. Nathan Cooper. "Hey, Sarah," he said, voice calm as ever. "You busy?" "Not particularly," I said. "Good. You ready to come back to work?" I froze. "If you still trust me." He chuckled. "I trust people who tell the truth even when it costs them. The rest, not so much." I exhaled. "So that's a yes." "That's a yes." "Come in tomorrow morning." "Oh, and bring a blazer. We're announcing something." The next day the office looked different. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the way people's eyes shifted when I walked in, like they didn't know whether to congratulate or gossip. Nathan met me in the main conference room, sunlight pouring through the tall windows. He handed me a folder and smiled. "Sarah Whitmore, welcome back. Effective immediately, you're reinstated as Regional Financial Director for the Western Division." I blinked. "That's a promotion." He shrugged. "Technically, it's a realignment. I just think the company could use more people who understand that numbers mean nothing without integrity." "Thank you," I said, my voice quiet. "You earned it," he replied. "Now let's make sure this year ends better than it started." When I got home, Ethan was on the living room floor, surrounded by Lego pieces and empty juice boxes. "Hey, Mom," he said without looking up. "Did they let you go back?" "They did." I said, setting my bag down. He looked up, then eyes wide. "You got promoted." I laughed. "I got reinstated." "That's different." He grinned. "No, it's better. It means they know who you really are." I knelt beside him, brushing a piece of red Lego from his hair. "You're getting too smart for your own good. That's what you said about Grandma. Once he said, I couldn't help it." I laughed. "Touché. That weekend I wanted to celebrate, but not with dinner reservations or champagne. Instead, I picked up the phone and called Laura Jenkins. "Do you guys still need volunteers on Saturdays?" I asked. "Always," she said. "You bringing the kid?" "Yeah," I said. "And pizza." When Ethan and I arrived at the shelter, the air was thick with the smell of tomato sauce and laughter. Someone had strung paper snowflakes along the windows. Kids were playing checkers on the floor, their laughter echoing through the hall. Laura met us by the door, wiping her hands on a towel. "You really brought pizza," she said, smiling. "I keep my promises." I said. Ethan handed her a stack of board games he'd picked out. "For the kids," he said shyly. Laura crouched to his level. "That's very kind of you. You know, traditions can start anywhere." Ethan looked up at me. "Is this one of ours now?" I nodded. "Yeah, ours started the day we stopped apologizing." Later, as the kids crowded around the tables eating and laughing, I stood by the window watching the snow fall again outside. It was gentle this time. No wind, no storm. just quiet flakes drifting against the glass. When the dust settles, honesty is the only currency that doesn't lose value. Ethan tugged on my sleeve, handing me a paper plate with a slice of pizza. "You need to eat too," he said. I smiled, sitting down beside him. "You're right. Let's make that our next tradition, listening to you more often." He grinned mouthful. "Deal." Laura passed by with a stack of plates and winked at me. I watched her walk away, her shoulders relaxed, her laugh mixing with the noise of the room. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. The night stretched soft and simple. No expectations, no performance. Just warmth, laughter, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the best way to rebuild is to start with less and make it enough. The call came late on a Thursday when the house was quiet, except for the sound of Ethan turning pages in the living room. My phone buzzed once, twice, then fell silent. I didn't recognize the number, but something in my gut told me to answer. Sarah. The voice was small, uneven. My mother. "It's your father," she said. "He's in the hospital. Stress, they think. His blood pressure." She stopped, her breath catching. "They said it was bad for a while. He wouldn't listen." I stood by the window, the street outside washed in white. "Is he conscious?" "Yes. They sedated him for now." A pause, softer this time. "You don't have to come, but I thought you should know." "I'll come," I said before I could talk myself out of it. The drive to Greenwood Village felt longer than it should have. The streets were half-frozen tire tracks cutting through the snow like scars. I hadn't been back there in years, not since I'd packed my things and stopped answering his calls. The hospital parking lot glowed under floodlights, snow swirling like ash in the air. Inside, everything smelled like antiseptic and sleep. The hallways hummed with machines and low conversation. I found the room easily, though my legs didn't want to move closer. Through the glass I could see him, my father, lying in the bed, frail in a way I'd never seen. The man who once filled every room with his voice now looked smaller than the blankets covering him. Even in rest, his face was tight, as if he was still arguing with someone in his dreams. For a long time, I just stood there. The hum of the heart monitor was steady, almost defiant. I thought about the years spent trying to earn his approval, the quiet punishments, the lectures about image reputation control. All the times he told me not to make everything so personal. It was always personal. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a single note written on plain paper. "Rest. I'm not angry. I'm just done disappearing." I placed it on the small counter by the door and turned to leave. In the hallway, I nearly collided with my mother. She looked thinner, her face drawn tight, a scarf wrapped around her neck like armor. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other, the years of resentment hanging between us like a fog. "He won't change," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I know," I said. "Then maybe we should—" Her eyes filled, and she nodded a small, fragile motion. "I'm trying," she whispered. "That's a start." We stood there for a second too long. Two people who'd spent most of their lives pretending to be strangers. Then a nurse walked past, breaking the moment. My mother turned toward the window, watching him through the glass. I touched her arm lightly before walking away. Outside, the snow had started again. Thicker this time, heavy flakes tumbling fast and silent. The air bit at my skin, sharp but clean. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is stay gone. By the time I reached home, it was after midnight. The house was warm. Ethan still awake, sitting cross-legged on the couch, with a book open on his lap. He looked up as I walked in. "You okay, Mom?" I nodded. "Just tired." He closed the book carefully. "Was it Grandpa?" "Yeah. Is he gonna be okay?" "I think so." He hesitated, then asked, "Are you gonna see him again?" I sat beside him, pulling the blanket over both of us. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Sometimes loving someone means knowing when not to go back." He thought about that for a while, then leaned his head against my shoulder. "That's weird," he murmured. "But it kinda makes sense." I smiled faintly. "It does, doesn't it?" We sat there in silence, the clock ticking soft behind us. My phone buzzed once on the coffee table. A new message. Emily. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I want to start over." I stared at it for a moment, the words glowing in the dark. Then I typed back. "When you stop living for pictures, we'll talk." I set the phone down and exhaled. Ethan looked up. "Mom." "Yeah, are we okay now?" I looked at him. Really looked. and felt something unclench in my chest. "Yeah," I said. "For the first time, I think we are." He smiled, small and sleepy, and went back to his book. I watched him read, his brow furrowed, his lips moving silently with the words. The lamp threw a warm light across the room, turning everything gold. Peace doesn't come when they say sorry. It comes when you stop waiting for it. Outside, the snow kept falling, the kind that covers everything, that makes even broken things look new. I closed my eyes and let the quiet fill the house. By the time the next December rolled around, the house felt smaller in the best way. The walls held warmth instead of tension. The calendar flipped quietly to the 31st. And for once, I didn't feel the weight of it pressing against my chest. Outside Centennial lay under a smooth sheet of snow. The rooftops glistened in the moonlight, and the air smelled like wood smoke and cinnamon from a neighbor's kitchen. Ethan and I sat on the porch, wrapped in thick blankets, 2 mugs of cocoa steaming between us. The snow creaked under our boots every time we moved. He blew on his drink and looked up at the sky. "Think Grandma will call this year?" I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that knows too much and forgives anyway. "No calls," I said. "No chaos." "Perfect." He nodded, accepting it like a fact instead of a wound. The fireworks from downtown started early. Small bursts of gold flickering across the horizon. They painted the mountain line in quick, trembling light. Ethan pointed at one that split into 3 perfect arcs before fading. "That one looks like a crown," he said. "Maybe that means this year belongs to you," I told him. He grinned, cheeks pink from the cold. "What about you, Mom?" I looked out toward the distant skyline, the faint hum of the city echoing in the snow. "I think my year already started," I said. He leaned against my arm, quiet again. I could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, calm and unguarded. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined a night this simple, feeling this full. Inside, the clock ticked softly toward midnight. My laptop sat open on the kitchen table, half forgotten after I'd checked a few work emails earlier. Then a soft ping broke the stillness. "Do you want me to get it?" Ethan asked. "Sure," I said, brushing a bit of snow from his shoulder. He slipped inside and came back a moment later, holding the laptop carefully in both hands. "It's from the shelter," he said. I took it, the light from the screen reflecting in his eyes. The subject line read, "A thank you from all of us." I clicked it open, and the message appeared in simple black text. "Thanks to your donation last year, we were able to open a new housing wing before Christmas. We named it the Whitmore Wing. You've given a lot of people a reason to believe in second chances." A laugh escaped me, quiet but real. "Guess something good kept my name," I said. Ethan leaned his head on my shoulder. "That's pretty awesome," he said. "It is," I whispered. "Better than any legacy money could buy." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the far-off cheers and the soft whistle of fireworks bursting miles away. The world outside felt distant, safe. Every explosion lit the snow for a split second, and then darkness settled again, peaceful and forgiving. Revenge isn't rage. It's reclaiming the quiet they once took from you. I looked at Ethan and realized how much he'd changed in just 1 year. He was taller, his face less round, but his eyes were still kind. He'd grown into the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself, something I was still learning. The clock struck midnight. Fireworks exploded in a chorus, the sky glowing silver and red and gold all at once. Ethan lifted his mug. "Happy New Year, Mom. Happy New Year, kiddo." He took a sip, then added, "I like this better than parties." "So do I," I said. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The fireworks began to fade, leaving only smoke drifting through the cold air. The sound of cheering from far away dissolved into the wind. If you've ever started a new year by letting go, instead of holding on, I said softly, almost to myself, "Tell me, what did peace sound like when it finally arrived?" I looked over at Ethan. His eyes half closed, his breath rising in little clouds. The question wasn't really for him, but he smiled anyway, like he understood. Inside, the house glowed faintly from the light of the kitchen window. The laptop still sat open on the table, the email from the shelter waiting, the cursor blinking under my name. Proof that sometimes even the parts of you they tried to erase can build something lasting. Ethan reached for my hand, his fingers cold but sure. Next year, he said, can we do the same thing? Exactly the same, I said. Just us, the snow and the fireworks. He nodded, leaning his head against me again. The last of the fireworks shimmered over the mountains before fading into the night. The air grew still and the only sound left was our breathing. For once, the silence didn't mean something was missing. It meant we'd finally made room for peace to stay. And maybe, just maybe, that's how healing sounds when it finally decides to arrive. If you've ever found yourself starting over after everything fell apart, tell me how you knew it was time. Tell me what your quiet looked like when it finally became home.